Hello, I am Susie. This is my podcast. Welcome. Thanks for joining me. This is part 2 of a series I am doing on WeRk. I don't know why I just said it. I said it like I think of it in my mind, just spelled WERK, work. Work, like Britney Spears' work. In the last episode, I rambled considerably about the history of labor in the United States and some of the social impacts of that in terms of the formation of the economic system of labor in the United States, having been formulated from slavery and then subsequently from convict labor after the Civil War. Which brings us to the industrial age. And the industrial age throughout the world was a revolution in many regards. And probably the biggest impact was definitely in labor. At work, automation was created for the first time, and the ability to increase production on mass scales using fewer people through mechanization. It's great. Paper, but here again, it's nascent in an age where slavery was de facto kind of the norm, right? Through systems of peonism, through systems of exploitation, of class-based discrimination. One of the most horrible attributions of the industrial age was child labor. That's just gross. I mean, it was really abusive. Women and children both were just absolutely abused in those systems. I mean, workers in general were not treated fairly, but women and children in particular were vulnerable and therefore easy prey, and were preyed upon with a great deal of enthusiasm. If you are a fan of Charles Dickens, you'll know what I'm talking about. He's a big, advocate for workers, and wrote a lot about the plight of the workers. Mind you, he dramatized, of course. He saw the beauty in those people that others didn't see. They were thought of as sort of the low class, and he saw angels there as well. And so Charles Dickens was a unique and gifted individual, a gift to us, in my opinion, as an artist. Be that as it may, the industrial age led to a phase of exploitation in the United States that was just really, really gross. And it found its demise in socialist ideals in America. Well, in Europe initially, obviously. Germany, specifically. More on that later. But it was socialist ideals as proposed by Karl Marx that really helped workers understand a means by which they could push back on what was an oppressive system, that, there were more of them than there were of the producers. There were more of them than there were, owners of factories. And moreover, the factories, mechanized or not, they were not going to work if there was nobody there to operate those machines, e.g. strikes. Those are socialist inspired ideas, and those ideals found their way to America, in the early part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century. Working conditions for the poor, for children, were just abominable throughout the United States, and in particular in the South, but also in the North, where there had been industrial centers, since around the time of the Civil War. So, New York is an excellent example. Chicago, there were lots of East Coast and Midwest cities in the North that epitomized exploitation of labor, and they did so as part of a natural system that was happening all over the place. I mean, technological advancements that progress exponentially allow producers to increase production without changing the structure of labor. So that ideal of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie that we were talking about a moment ago is what manifested in the revolution that transpired in the creation of labor unions. And also allowed for the emergence of a middle class in the United States, as opposed to, a ruling class and an aristocratic class. It was a double-edged sword, as most things in America tend to be. But be that as it may, I mean, it was the implementation of socialist ideas that allowed workers to galvanize in such a way that they could influence politics and create the 40-hour work week. Congratulations to you. You now, if you're in a certain type of job, really in any kind of job, you get time off, you get paid time off, you get weekends off, you get benefits. You can thank labor unions for pretty much all of that. Women in the workplace were really one of the founding or the foundational pieces of unions. That's not really talked about that much. How women and the suffragist movement, was sort of born in through labor struggle. Unions were a response to abysmal working conditions, long hours, low wages, and unions were propagandized as communism, during a time when, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in like the early 1900s, everybody was pretty scared of communism, the idea of communism, because, and I have a lot of thoughts about this. I don't know, maybe I'll talk about this like sort of in greater detail, but, to skate the surface of it, I think that socialism died in communism because the Russian identity was so, it was heavily forged through feudalism. So they still had this, their conception of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was still filtered through this sieve of autocratic regime. There's still an elite class. There's still, they're oligarchs now, but there's still like a power class. And that power class ultimately exploits the work of everybody else to both remain in power and to hoard the wealth, which is why communism never worked in Russia, because they fucked it up. They just didn't do it right. But I'll talk about this like a little more detail, later. But the propagandizing of unions as communism just created this specter of fear in so many people that those movements really were vulnerable to corruption. And ultimately, that's, I think what happened to them to allow them to really lose the saliency of their power, right? Like they're still seen as burdensome by business. They're a nuisance to business more than anything else. I'm glad they're there. And I think that there's progress back to hopefully formation of labor unions and organization that really, help people get out of some shitty circumstances. Because again, we're kind of wandering back to this, kleptocratic kind of, I get mine, and and you get mine. Like you get mine, and no, that's not right. Like I get mine and I get yours. That's not cool or fair, right? Like as a worker, all of the fruits of your labor are just given to someone who ultimately, gets to buy, a yacht for every day of the week and one for his friends too. Like he's, that, and I'm not just like, Jeff Bezos is the devil, whatever. I don't know the guy, but his way of doing business is frighteningly ruthless and not at all, I think, measured through a lens of human relationships. It's just because he can. That's scary. I mean, it's scary that we have a system that allows that. It's scary that we have a culture that esteems that looks at that and is like, success. That's, yes, he made it. If you've ever seen Bo Burnham's special on Netflix, it's called Inside, and he made it during the pandemic. And he does a couple things on Jeffrey Bezos, but there's this one where he's wearing like a ghillie suit. And there's like weird strobe lights, and he's just singing. He's got sunglasses on, and he's just singing Jeffrey Bezos' name over and over again. And at one point, he's like, "You did it!" It really makes me laugh. Google it if nothing else. If you don't want to watch the whole special, which is totally worth watching, it's very affecting and very funny, and just really a visual spectacle that's wonderful. But just that bit itself is only like 15 seconds, and it's just solid gold. Two thumbs up, Bo Burnham. Thank you for giving us that. What happened to unions? Where did they go? Why did they lose their power? I'm so curious about that. I see an easy path, right, of explanation, which is labor is money. And I mean, if you're a certain person, labor is money. And money, it breeds power, and power breeds cruelty, if nothing else. But unions, it seems, were particularly vulnerable to corruption because a union organization is still kind of a governing body, and it doesn't, require a lot of friction or penetration, perhaps, to tempt somebody, who's really working hard and getting not a lot of reward for what they're doing. It's hard work. Representation and service is hard, and it's, in my experience, quite thankless while you're doing it. I mean, posthumously, everybody loves you, but you're dead, so you can't appreciate it at that point. During your life, it's not as frequent that you get the accolades that you deserve for just like showing up and, speaking up for others. That's important to remember, by the way. Every so often, just like, reach out to somebody who did a small thing and let them know that it's appreciated, because sometimes that small thing was really, really hard for that person for whatever reason. And sometimes just hearing somebody be like, "Good job, buddy," is enough to be like, "Oh, shit, like, thank God it was worth it." So just like, tuck that away and use it for a rainy day. But, you know, again, this vulnerability of temptation, and then where does that come from? Okay, well, unions. I think everybody probably is aware of the intersection that evolved of unions and the mafia in the United States in the middle part into the second, in the second half of the 20th century. And the mob had wow, they had a good game. They did. They had a good game going. They were smart guys, and they rode that gravy train for a really, really long time. And they did so because they were, smart about it. They were quiet about it. They had a lot of money to burn and had no scruples about murdering people. So they just kind of like created the pathway for themselves. But they understood that the pathway ultimately ended in politics. It ended with, judges and politicians, senators and congresspeople on the take, as it were. That temptation, has been present in our politics since, forever, probably present in all politics since forever. And it's really, I think, probably difficult to resist in a culture that presumes that it's normal and accepted. I can see somebody like Mr. Smith, goes to Washington style, showing up and being like, oh, oh, I didn't realize this was what I was actually signing up for. It's honestly one of the reasons I would never run for public office. I can see, I love people and I would love to speak for people and represent people. And I think that I could do it very well. But, I'm emotionally fragile, so I can't really do thankless work. I need to be thanked. Please thank me for my work. Acknowledge me, love me. I need your love. But Politics is so hard and it's such a cruel game, and it is really not about the business of governing. A lot of the time it's about just getting reelected, and it's about the money, and it's about the power, and I'm not interested in any of that stuff. So that's why I would be a bad politician. Some would say that maybe I'd be the best politician, but and then you don't live in the world. You don't understand. Like one person, I'm not that guy. I'm not up for it. But my influence can be better used in different ways. I hope this way. I hope that this is a thing that I can say I've been able to make compelling arguments that people see and be like, oh, okay, I didn't really think of it that way. Like that makes me think about it a little bit differently, and I can now, reassess my position. Not change it or totally agree with her or whatever it may be, but like that's a facet of this situation or this issue or this idea that hadn't occurred to me before, that I see legitimacy in perhaps, or that I find compelling at the very least. And that gives me, it widens the picture a little bit. That's usually enough for people to begin to be able to take in, more viewpoints and be able to balance things through a different kind of prism, right? Like different voices and seeing them without sort of a preferential basis. I think that that's a process that a lot of people go through when they hear something that like connects, but that they don't agree with, that doesn't harmonize with their current understanding of the world. It's like like when you hear a guitar string that's like out of tune, like a twang, like, and you're like, what? That's wait, right? Like it kind of stops you, it throws you a little bit. I think that's healthy and good, and I encourage that. So hopefully, listener, dear listener, I hope that you've experienced some of that in this little journey of mine. But going back to the point that I was making about politics and the mob and unions, because there is a certain segment of people that continue to ideologically think of labor as a resource that is sort of expendable and that is not really connected to a living person. And it's thought of again sort of in the terms of commoditization. It's a thing you can trade or whatever. Then it's kind of easier to see how when a corrupt influence gets into that framework, it really just sours the pot, for everybody. And unfortunately, I think that what it did do in the States is it really harmed the credibility of unions for a really long time. And it was already an uphill battle. Again, see the before mentioned comment vis-a-vis the propaganda of unions as communism. It was a difficult enough thing for labor to make the policy influence that it did. And then when a corrupting influence is introduced and it erodes from the inside out, then where are the workers then? What's your recourse at that point? And so while I think unions still exist and I think they'd still do valuable work, I think that their credibility is damaged. And I'm happy to see a reemergence of organized labor that really does prioritize the rights of workers in the modern age. Labor in its origin was it was advocating for, quote unquote, unskilled labor, right? Like it was advocating a lot for factory workers, manufacturers, and evolved into more of a middle class advocacy, group, in my opinion, and also became very politically powerful. The AFL-CIO's endorsement for a politician was highly sought after up until the last decade, maybe. It was a seriously big get if you were a candidate running for office, particularly if you were a Democrat, because we supposedly are all about labor and, protecting workers' rights. And, that's, funny because the Republican Party also claims, it sort of stakes its claim on representing the working class. They never really talk about workers' rights, but they do talk about representing and preserving the identity of the American, working class. the blue collar sector. Republicans like to talk about those guys a lot, but their policies seldom seem to favor those people, and do seem to favor more of a ruling class establishment in my view. So I, in the current day, seeing a win in New York, with Amazon, and also the guy that's like the president of the union. I'm so sorry, I don't know his name off the top of my head, but he's charming, and he's very like he has like a very like street fashion sensibility. Like dude's got a grill and like a cap. Like I'm not like a cap fashionista, but like I notice that like there's a certain segment of like hip hop culture that likes a hat in like a brand new store bought state with like the tag still on and the bill is like flat, and he wears a cap like that. Like he's very stylish, but also just like so smart and just clearly so passionately about protecting these people and creating better lives for these people. I mean, some of the stuff that he talked about is like if a new person comes on, like there's like a group of people that like there's like a welcome wagon. They get them together and be like, if you got a gym membership, cancel it right now because you are never going to go there and you're never going to need it and you're going to be too tired. Like, here are the tips for when you have to do a bathroom break and you don't, you can't meet your quota. Like they've created this guerrilla warfare, against Amazon out of a sense of necessity, because they were, their health was being destroyed under these conditions. And Amazon was just like, fuck you, like, you don't, you got no power. Well, now they got some power. So it'll be interesting to see how that emerges. And moreover, if there are other places in the country that are more successful at fighting that fight, because Amazon has been vicious. They've applied millions of dollars to suppress these people's organization efforts. It's disgusting, in my opinion, but also it feels like it would be cheaper to just like submit and be like, okay, we'll treat you like dignified humans and like increase your wages and allow you, more human hours. Maybe even we'll hire like some more people as one of the largest employers, on the earth. Maybe we could afford to hire more people and maybe pay them better and, shorter shifts and more benefits. And, there's good in that. Maybe you could even pass some of those that cost burden through to your customers. Maybe it would be worth it to them. Maybe it would create a more competitive environment in which other competitors are able to compete in that space rather than you like holding all the cards at the lowest prices because you're able to abuse your employees. I mean, it feels pretty straightforward to me, but I don't prioritize profit over human life as a rule. I'm not a billionaire, for one thing. So imagine if I were a billionaire. I don't like to imagine that really because it feels like it would be really stressful. But if I were a billionaire, I feel like I would want to get rid of that money as quickly as I could. Like it would just be burning a hole in me, like in me, like, and I'd just be like, take Jesus Christ, take it off of me, get it, bleh, get it off of me. Um, but that's me. I don't, I want enough. That's kind of my gig, and enough for me, right? Like it's subjective, right? So I don't want enough to like just get by. I want enough. Like I want enough to have the things that I have to give, my kids things that they want. It's not just about things, right? Experiences, the lives that they want to feel safe and secure and happy. That's all I really want. And for me, that measuring stick is not billionaire high. I'm perfectly contented. But I also, I've made sacrifices in my quest for balance. And, I work in one of the most capitalist sectors of a capitalist economy. And I do quite well there. As a matter of fact, I'm an excellent business person. You wouldn't think so listening, but I'm good at business. I'm good at thinking logically and solving problems. And that's ultimately where I focus my attention. And when you're focused on a goal, it's easy to be good at it. But if your goal is just a numbers game in terms of dollars, well, that's a little different, in my opinion. That's not how I was raised, I dare say. I wasn't raised in a hippie commune. For those of you who imagine my childhood as like a savage, feral child, no, I was raised in a very middle class, community. It was a little more diverse than most because I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and, it's a pretty diverse community over here, just as a rule, and has been historically for a long time. I grew up in farmland, I mean, it was predominantly white in my area. I was raised in a single parent household. So my mom worked a lot to, give us the lives that we wanted. But my mom is a pretty esoteric person in her way. She has a broad field of vision. She's a Pisces. So she's got that dreamy quality of, like, imagination, aspirational ideals. She used to say to me all the time when I was growing up that your job is the means by which you finance your lifestyle. And it has stayed with me as a guiding, principle in my life. I don't identify with my work as something that defines me as a human. I think of other things that I do, other forms of work, as my manifestation of my humanity. And that sort of circles back to that distinction I was talking about at the outset here of, like, work versus labor. I think work is a more spiritual experience for a lot of people. I think that's why a lot of people identify so much with their work, right? They identify so heavily with their work, and if they don't succeed in the way that some arbitrary model suggests they should, or goals that they may have set for themselves, or a role model that they may have, if they don't achieve that threshold, it's just failure. It's just failure all around. And I think that's toxic. I think that's a really problematic way to think, and it's not a healthy or true view of a human life. Work is an endeavor that I think both does allow for the sustenance piece, but I think that it's also something that, like, ceteris paribus, right? All things being equal, let's just say hypothetically that every human person had, like, a mystical allotment of resource meeting, needs, like a pill every day that you got that's just like all your basic needs are met, period, right? The rest is just gravy. I think people would still look for work. I think they would still look for a way to find purpose in their lives, an act that manifests a belief in some way. I think that's a human thing to do. I think it's perfectly normal. But I think that the intersection between work and labor is where it can get slippery and problematic. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next thing. And I hope you'll come back. This has been a journey. I've prepared. This is probably the least prepared episode that I've done so far. I wanted to record this like a week ago, but life has been getting in my way, and I have been getting in my own way, which is the thing that I do. So I'm recording this later than I anticipated, but I'm glad I'm getting it done because I've wanted to do it, for a while. And yeah, there's more to come though. So I hope you'll come back. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed it so far. In the next episode, I've got a lot of thoughts on kind of that idea of socialism that I talked about before. So that's going to be fun, I think, and a little perhaps controversial. I don't know, depending on who you are. But I hope you'll join me. So thank you for listening. If you like it, I hope you'll share it. Let somebody know who you think might enjoy it. And please, feedback. I love it. I need it. I want it. Be kind, but, disagree if you do. I'd love to hear more. You can reach me by email, Susie Makes a Podcast, SUCI Makes a Podcast @gmail.com. Or you can also hit me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. So thank you so much for joining me, and until next time.